The little girl's voice cut through the noise of the barn like a knife through silence, and Esther Hurst felt her heart stop beating entirely. "Miss Esther, will you name her? Papa said I could choose who names her, and I choose you." Esther stood perfectly still in the golden hay-scented air of the Fletcher barn, her fingers pressed against the rough wood of the stall gate, her breath locked somewhere between her lungs and her lips. 6-year-old Clara Fletcher stood before her with enormous brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile, holding up a newborn foal's velvety muzzle, as if presenting the most sacred gift in the world. The foal was copper-colored, impossibly delicate, her legs like 4 trembling sticks searching for their purpose on the earth. She was breathtaking, but it was not the foal that broke Esther's composure. It was the weight behind the request. It was the fact that Joseph Fletcher stood in the shadows just beyond the stall door, and he had gone so terribly, powerfully still. Esther could feel his eyes on her the way you feel the sun through glass, warm but contained, pressing but not yet free. She could feel the trap of this moment, the impossible beauty of it, the way it had seized her by the throat without warning. She had spent 4 months on the Fletcher ranch telling herself she was just the school teacher. She had spent 4 months reminding herself every single morning that she was employed here to teach 3 children, collect a modest salary, and then move on to somewhere else, somewhere that did not have a man with dark eyes and calloused hands who looked at her sometimes like she was the one thing he had never dared to pray for. 4 months of maintaining her distance, her professionalism, her carefully constructed walls. And then a 6-year-old girl had demolished all of it in one sentence, because Clara was not asking about the foal. Joseph knew it. Esther knew it. And in the terrible, shaking silence of that warm Texas barn in the spring of 1882, every secret that had been building between them rose to the surface like something long buried finally breaking free of the ground. Esther's eyes lifted slowly from Clara's hopeful face and found Joseph's across the dim space of the barn, and what she saw in his expression was not what she expected. She expected awkwardness. She expected embarrassment on behalf of his daughter's transparent manipulation. She expected perhaps a polite, apologetic smile. Instead, she found something raw, something that looked frighteningly close to hope. It had started, as so many things do, not with a grand declaration or a dramatic arrival, but with desperation dressed up in ordinary clothing. Esther Hurst had arrived in the town of Caldwell, Texas on a Thursday in late January of 1882, stepping off the Southern Pacific with a trunk, a carpet bag, a teaching certificate from the County Board of Education in Missouri, and exactly $9.40 to her name. She was 26 years old and had been teaching school for 4 years, moving from one small post to the next whenever situations became complicated, whenever the darkness of her past caught up to her, whenever she needed to put more miles between herself and the man who had once called himself her fiancé and had turned out to be neither honorable nor safe. Caldwell was not a glamorous destination. It sat on the Kishom Trail in southern Kansas. Actually, it straddled the Kansas-Texas border, which made it interesting in a lawless sort of way, and it was still in the process of deciding whether it wanted to be civilized or not. Cattle drives still rolled through twice a year, turning the main street into a river of dust and horn and noise. The saloon on 2nd Street never fully closed. The town had 2 churches and a jail that was used more regularly than either of the churches, and it had recently lost its only schoolteacher to an unfortunate encounter with a rattlesnake. The posting had reached Esther through the County Education Board, forwarded along the chain of correspondence that connected small frontier towns to the broader machinery of governance. The salary was $30 a month, which was honest pay for the territory, plus room and board either in the town's boarding house or as an alternative arrangement with one of the families whose children attended the school. It was the boarding house she had imagined herself occupying when she'd sent her letter of application. It was a private room and a modest privacy she had planned. What she had not planned for was that the boarding house had burned down in February, 2 weeks before her arrival, and that the only remaining option for a newly hired schoolteacher was the alternative arrangement, the one where she lived with a family. The family in question was the Fletchers. Joseph Fletcher ran a cattle and horse ranch 7 miles outside of Caldwell, on the western side of the Kishom Trail. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, brown-haired, with the kind of quiet that lived in a man who had seen hard things and chosen not to talk about them. He had 3 children: Thomas, who was 11 and conducted himself with the seriousness of someone twice his age; Margaret, who was 9 and possessed an intellect so sharp it occasionally left adults bleeding without realizing it; and Clara, who was 6 and operated entirely on love, instinct, and an unerring ability to identify exactly what a person most needed to hear. Their mother, Elizabeth Fletcher, had died of fever 18 months before Esther's arrival. The ranch still held the shape of her absence, the way a room holds the shape of furniture that has been removed. You could see exactly where everything had been, even if nothing remained. Esther had learned all of this from the county sheriff's wife, Mrs. Dunbar, who had collected her from the station and driven her out to the ranch in a buckboard while delivering an uninterrupted monologue about every soul in the county and their particular complications. "Joseph Fletcher is a good man, Mrs. Dunbar had said, with the specific emphasis people use when they want you to know they are telling you something important. He keeps to himself too much since Elizabeth passed, but he is decent and fair, and his children are a credit to him. You will have no trouble there, Miss Hurst." What Mrs. Dunbar had not mentioned was that Joseph Fletcher had eyes the color of deep creek water after rain, or that when he met Esther at the gate of his ranch and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Hurst. Welcome to the Double F," she had felt something shift inside her chest that she could not immediately name and did not want to examine too closely. The house was good and solid. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a wide kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, a covered porch that looked out over the rolling grassland toward the distant blue suggestion of hills. The children had come out to see her arrive, Thomas with measured curiosity, Margaret with frank assessment, Clara with her arms already open. Clara had hugged Esther's legs before a single word of introduction had been spoken. "I knew you would come," Clara had said with absolute certainty, as if she had been waiting for a specific person and Esther was clearly the one she'd been expecting. Joseph, behind his daughter, had said quietly, "Clara, let Miss Hurst settle in first." But there had been something in his voice, a softness around the admonishment, a kind of wonder that he was trying to keep professional, that Esther had filed away without meaning to. She set up her schoolroom in the converted parlor of the ranch house, because the actual Caldwell schoolhouse still needed repairs after the same windstorm season that had carried the boarding house down. 3 students was not exactly the classroom she was used to, but the education board paid her regardless, and there were 3 or 4 other children from neighboring ranches who came out 2 days a week to join the morning lessons. She threw herself into the work. She had always found safety and purpose in the structure of lessons and the discipline of knowledge. She taught Thomas advanced mathematics and the principles of land surveying, which he absorbed with quiet ferocity. She read aloud to Margaret every evening after supper Dickens, primarily, because Margaret found his characterizations philosophically engaging, and they would argue about the motivations of fictional people until the fire burned low. With Clara she worked on letters and numbers, but mostly she just listened, because Clara spoke with the kind of unfiltered wisdom that 6-year-olds sometimes carry before the world teaches them to edit themselves. She stayed out of Joseph Fletcher's way. That was the honest description. She was careful, deliberate, calibrated in maintaining appropriate distance from him, because she recognized the danger of the situation with the clarity of someone who had been burned before. Not by Joseph specifically. He was nothing like Marcus Grier, her former fiancé back in Missouri, who had used charm like a weapon and vulnerability like a doorway to walk through uninvited. Joseph was not a man of charm in that calculated sense. He was a man of presence. He simply existed in a room and filled it, the way a fire fills a room, not by trying, but by the nature of what he was. She found reasons not to eat supper with the family most nights. She took long walks after the children were in bed. She kept her door firmly closed and her thoughts firmly redirected. But there were evenings when she could not avoid it, when the children specifically wanted everyone at the table, when the weather drove her indoors before she expected, when Clara pulled her by the hand into the kitchen and said, "Papa made biscuits and they are very good, Miss Esther. Please come." And on those evenings she sat across the table from Joseph Fletcher and tried not to notice how carefully he poured her coffee, how he always made sure there was enough of whatever she preferred, how he listened when she spoke and truly listened, not the polite performance of attention that most men offered women, but the real thing, the kind of listening that meant he was storing what she said, turning it over, thinking about it. He never pressed her for information about herself. He never asked the questions she was most afraid of. He simply made space for her, and that, she discovered, was somehow more dangerous than any interrogation could have been. March brought rain and mud and the particular restlessness that comes to Texas hill country when the land is preparing for spring. Esther was walking back from the creek one afternoon. She had taken to walking there alone in the late afternoon, when lessons were finished and the children were doing their chores, when she came around the bend in the willow trees and found Joseph sitting on the far bank with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of a man having a very private conversation with himself. She stopped. She should have turned back. She did not turn back. He heard her and looked up, and for one unguarded moment she saw all of it, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the thing he carried that had no name she could give it, the way he was holding himself together with a combination of duty and stubbornness that was admirable and heartbreaking in equal measure. Then he arranged his face into something more composed and said, "Miss Hurst," as if she had arrived at a formal appointment. "Mr. Fletcher," she replied, and sat down on the bank 12 feet away from him because she was not going to pretend she hadn't seen his unguarded face, and she was not going to retreat, but she was also going to maintain that 12 feet of distance with the dedication of a soldier holding a line. They sat there for almost 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Thomas told me you explained the mathematics of surveying to him, that you showed him how to calculate land measurements from a fixed point. He picks things up quickly," she said. "He has a very precise mind. His mother was like that." A pause. "Elizabeth, she kept all the books for the ranch. I haven't been as good at it since she passed." Another pause, longer. "I'm sorry, that wasn't appropriate dinner table conversation." "We're not at dinner," Esther said simply. He looked at her sideways, something almost like a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one, the implication of warmth. "No," he agreed. "I suppose we're not." She did not tell him about Marcus Grier that afternoon. She did not tell him about the town in Missouri, where she could no longer walk down certain streets without the particular humiliation that attaches to a woman who had been publicly discarded, whose personal correspondence had been read aloud in the barbershop as entertainment, whose dark past had been advertised by a man who had nothing to lose and found great sport in her having everything to lose. She did not tell him any of that. She sat with her own feet in their boots, because she was a woman with more dignity than impulse dangling over the cold creek water, and she listened to Joseph Fletcher talk haltingly about his late wife and his children and the difficulties of raising them alone, and she realized with a terrifying clarity that she was not maintaining her distance at all. She was, in fact, already in trouble. The thing about forbidden feelings in close quarters is that they do not respect the boundaries you construct. Esther had built her walls with great care and experience. She had placed her emotions behind them with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what it cost to let them loose. And yet those walls were being dismantled by the most ordinary, unexpected things. Joseph's oldest boy Thomas came to her in April with a problem he had been working on for 2 weeks, a calculation for the expansion of the upper pasture fence that required more geometry than he had been taught. He spread his paper on the school table and looked at her with those serious eyes that were so entirely his father's, and she taught him the principles of triangulation with growing enthusiasm. And when they got it right together, and Thomas's face broke into a rare, genuine smile, Joseph had appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom and watched the two of them and said nothing. But the expression on his face was something she found herself thinking about for days afterward. Margaret came to her with a different kind of problem. Margaret had found a book among her mother's things, a collection of poetry, Whitman and Emily Dickinson and Tennyson, and she brought it to Esther with the careful reverence of someone who understood that books belonging to the dead are sacred objects. "Did you know my mother?" Margaret asked, as if the question were perfectly logical. "No, sweetheart, I didn't have the privilege." "She liked Tennyson best," Margaret said. "Papa told me." A beat. "Papa doesn't like to talk about her very much." Not because he didn't love her. He loved her very much, but because it hurts. Margaret looked at Esther with those sharp, perceptive eyes. "Do you think it is better to love something even if it hurts you when it is gone, or better to not love it and never be hurt?" Esther had spent a very long time thinking about an honest answer to that question. "I think," she said slowly, "that the hurt is part of the love. You cannot have one without the other. And I think that trying not to love things in order to protect yourself from loss is a kind of loss in itself." Margaret had considered that for a long moment, then nodded. "That is what I thought," she said, as if Esther had confirmed something she had already decided. "I told Papa that he should not be afraid to love things again." Esther had gone very still. "What did your papa say?" "He said I was being presumptuous," Margaret said, "but he looked at me afterward with the same face he makes when I am right about something." She opened the poetry book. "Shall we read the Tennyson?" It was Clara, though, who operated without any pretense of subtlety whatsoever. Clara had decided in her first 24 hours of Esther's presence that this woman was the specific person their household had been missing, and she pursued this conclusion with the tenacity of a small, determined force of nature. She brought Esther wildflowers in the morning. She saved the best biscuit from every batch for Esther's plate. She retold entire long conversations between herself and her father over supper, conversations that inevitably highlighted every good quality Joseph possessed, with the unembarrassed advocacy of someone running a very transparent campaign. "Papa fixed the fence in the south pasture today," Clara would announce at supper, glancing between Esther and Joseph as if she were a newspaper editor reporting on events of great public significance. "All by himself. It was a very big fence." "It was a modest fence," Joseph would say, without looking up from his plate but with the slight color in his neck that suggested he was trying not to smile. "It was a big fence," Clara would insist. "Then, Miss Esther, don't you think that is very good?" Esther had learned to redirect these overtures with what she considered professional grace. She was genuinely fond of Clara. She admitted to herself in the privacy of her room, genuinely fond of all three of those children in a way that was becoming less professional and more simply true with every passing week. And she was not going to say what she felt about Joseph Fletcher. Not to herself, not out loud, not to anyone. That was decided. Then came the night in late April when Caldwell's most ambitious gossip, a woman named Vera Hutchins, arrived at the ranch for the ostensible purpose of delivering a contribution for the school's library fund, and used the visit to deliver what she actually came to deliver, a careful, smiling set of words designed to detonate. "We do worry, of course," Vera said, sitting at Esther's table and drinking Esther's coffee, "about the impropriety of the arrangement. A single woman living under the roof of a widower. People do talk, Miss Hurst, for both your sakes. I'm certain you understand." Esther understood exactly what was happening. She had seen this particular weapon before. The suggestion of impropriety, deployed like a trap, designed to force choices that benefited the person making the suggestion and no one else. "I'm employed as this family's schoolteacher," Esther said, with the controlled calm of someone who has learned that rising to this kind of bait only feeds it. The arrangement was approved by the county education board. "Oh, of course, Vera said, with a smile that acknowledged nothing and implied everything. "I only mention it because, well, people love to speculate, don't they? And you have a reputation to consider." After Vera had gone, Esther sat in the schoolroom for a long time with her hands flat on the table, staring at the wall, thinking about reputations and dark pasts and how a woman's secret vulnerabilities are always so much more useful to others than her actual qualities. She heard Joseph's boots on the porch and then his knock at the schoolroom door. "Miss Hurst, may I come in?" "Of course." He came in and stood near the door in the way he stood when he was thinking about something, with care upright, hat in hand, not quite at ease but trying to be respectful of her space. He had heard Vera's carriage arrive and leave, and she could see from his expression that the walls of the house were not as soundproof as they appeared. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing of the kind. I should have considered your position more carefully when I agreed to the arrangement," he said. "I thought you needed a placement and we needed a teacher, and it seemed straightforward. I didn't think about what it might cost you in terms of—" He stopped, rearranged his words. "If you would prefer to move to the Dunbar house in town, I'll speak to the sheriff's wife. She has the room since her daughter married." "Is that what you want?" Esther asked. She was looking at him directly, which she had learned was sometimes more honest than she intended. "No," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, and then seemed to understand what he had said and added carefully, "The children have benefited enormously from your teaching, and the arrangement has been good for the household." "Then I see no reason to change it," she said, "unless you feel there is one." He met her eyes. "No," he said again in the same honest, unadorned way. "I don't." She had gone back to her work after he left, and she had not permitted herself to analyze that exchange at any length whatsoever, because she could feel the walls beginning to waver, and she had worked very hard on those walls. May arrived and brought with it two important developments. The first was the birth of the foal. The mare, a chestnut named Lady who was one of Joseph's best breeding animals, had been pregnant since before Esther's arrival. By May she was heavy and uncomfortable, and spending most of her time in the barn, and Joseph was checking on her every few hours around the clock, with the focused attention of a man who understood what it cost to lose an animal you had counted on. The foal arrived on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. Esther had heard the commotion from her room, the movement of boots on the stairs, Clara's voice high and excited, the heavy barn door, and had dressed quickly and gone out because she had not been able to help herself. The foal was copper-red and female, and she was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful thing Esther had seen in recent memory. She lay in the straw while Lady cleaned her, and she made small sounds that were somewhere between a whinny and a sigh, and the children stood around her with the reverence of witnesses to something genuinely miraculous. Joseph was crouched in the straw with his sleeves rolled up, and he looked up when Esther came in and said, "Good morning," in a voice that was quieter than usual, roughened by a night without sleep, and somehow more human than any greeting he had given her before. "She's beautiful," Esther said. "Clara's been asking since last night who should name her," Thomas said with older brother pragmatism. "She keeps changing her mind." Clara was standing beside the foal with her small hand resting gently on the copper-red neck. She turned and looked at Esther with the expression of someone who has just made a decision that is much larger than it appears. "I want you to name her, Miss Esther," Clara said. "Papa said I could choose, and I choose you." The silence that fell in that barn was of a particular quality that Esther could feel in the back of her teeth. She looked at Clara. She looked at the foal. And then she looked at Joseph, who was still crouched in the straw, very still, watching her with the creekwater eyes that had been slowly and methodically undoing her careful, deliberate, professionally maintained walls for 4 months. He understood. She could see that he understood. Clara was not 6 years old and unaware of what she was doing, or perhaps she was, in the technical sense, but children operate on an instinctive frequency that bypasses all the adult mechanisms of caution and calculation. Clara wanted Esther to belong here. She was using the only currency she had to say so, and Joseph understood it, and he was not stopping it, which was its own declaration. Esther looked back at the foal, who had just lifted her head to look at her with liquid dark eyes. "Hope," Esther said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Her name is Hope." Clara's face was radiant. Thomas nodded with solemn approval. Margaret looked between Esther and her father with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed by observed evidence. Joseph said nothing, but when Esther glanced at him again, he was not looking at the foal. He was looking at her, with the expression she had been avoiding looking at for 4 months, the one that was not ambiguous, that did not permit her the comfortable distance of alternative interpretations, that was simply and entirely the face of a man who had decided something. She left the barn quickly after that. She told herself she needed breakfast. She told herself she needed composure. She told herself a great many things as she walked back to the house and stood in the kitchen with both hands on the wash basin and stared at the wall, breathing deliberately. The second development that May brought was the letter from Marcus Grier. It arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days after the foal was born. It came addressed in handwriting she recognized from across the room, and the sight of that handwriting produced a physical response in her body. A cold cascade from her shoulders down through her stomach, the specific terror of someone who has been hunted, understanding that they have been found. She took it to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and opened it with fingers that she forced to be steady. Marcus Grier was a man she had once been engaged to marry when she was 23. He had presented himself as a banker's son from Jefferson City, educated, charming, with a future that gleamed. He had courted her with the specific precision of someone who had identified exactly what she valued and constructed himself in its image. She had believed him. She had loved him, or loved who she believed him to be, which in retrospect was not the same thing at all. The truth of Marcus Grier had emerged in the way that bad truths tend to emerge gradually, then all at once. He was not a banker's son. He was a man of debts and concealed history, who had courted Esther because her teaching income was steady, and her lack of nearby family made her usefully isolated. When she had uncovered the deception and broken the engagement, he had responded with a campaign of reputational destruction so thorough and so vicious that she had been forced to leave Jefferson City and then Springfield, and then 3 subsequent posts, always 1 county ahead of the Whisper network, he maintained with the specific dedication of a man who had decided her suffering was owed to him. The letter from Marcus was brief. He had, he wrote, heard of her position in Caldwell. He was traveling through Kansas territory in June. He thought they should speak. He used the word unfinished 3 times. He used the phrase, "what you owe me," twice. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove and sat at the table afterward with her coffee going cold in front of her, making calculations. She could leave. She had done it before. She could write to the education board, cite personal reasons, be packed, and on the Southern Pacific within a week. It was the safer option, the option she knew, the one she had taken every time before when the darkness from her past had found her. She thought about Thomas's serious face absorbing triangulation principles. She thought about Margaret's Tennyson arguments and her bright, demanding mind. She thought about Clara's wildflowers and her certainty and her open arms, and the way she had looked in the barn that morning, radiant with the word hope. She thought about Joseph at the creek bank with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, the unguarded face he had worn for 1 moment before composing himself. She thought about what she had said to Margaret about love and loss, that the hurt is part of the love, that trying not to love things in order to protect yourself from loss is a kind of loss in itself. She had believed it when she said it. She believed it now. She was not going to leave. but she understood that whatever was building between herself and Joseph Fletcher needed to be addressed directly, because if Marcus Grier was coming to Caldwell, she could not let Joseph be blindsided by the wreckage of her history. He deserved to know. He deserved the choice that her honesty would allow him. She waited until that evening when the children were in bed and the house was quiet. Joseph was on the porch with his coffee, the way he often was at the end of the day, watching the stars come out over the dark grass. Esther came out and stood at the far end of the porch and said, "May I speak with you about something?" "Of course," he said, in the voice she had come to associate with his most careful attention. She told him everything. She told him about Marcus Grier. She told him about Jefferson City and the broken engagement and the systematic destruction of her reputation, the way it had followed her from post to post, the reason she kept moving. She told him about the letter that had arrived that morning and that she had burned. She told him that Marcus was coming in June and that whatever he wanted, money, reconciliation, the continued satisfaction of her distress, she was not going to give him any of it, but she wanted Joseph to know the truth of her situation before it arrived on his doorstep. She told him all of it in a careful, controlled voice, looking out at the dark grassland because it was easier than looking at him while she dismantled her own hidden history and laid it on the porch boards between them. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Joseph said, "Thank you for telling me." She had not been sure what she expected. Perhaps a careful retraction, a gentle but unmistakable withdrawal of whatever warmth he had been permitting himself to show her. Perhaps an offer of practical assistance, accompanied by a new and formal distance. Perhaps the careful diplomatic silence that men sometimes use when they want to say, "This changes things," without actually saying it. She had not expected what he actually said, which was, "He sounds like a man who believes that because he has hurt you, you belong to him. Those are the most dangerous kind." She turned to look at him. "Are you concerned about your position?" she asked carefully. "About having this situation arrive at the ranch?" "I'm concerned about you," he said, directly, simply, without strategic decoration. "What I feel about Marcus Grier arriving in my county is a separate thing, and it involves language I try not to use on the front porch." Something broke loose in her chest, a small and specific thing, like a knot that has been pulled tight for a long time finally releasing. "Joseph," she said, and then stopped, because it was the first time she had used his first name and they both heard it. He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail. "Esther," he said, and it was the first time he had used hers, and it was not a correction or a formality. It was just her name, said as if he had been saving it, as if it meant something to him that he was permitted to say it now. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, and laughed a little, which was not what she had planned but was entirely true. "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't. It has been a long time since he started again. When Elizabeth died, I made a promise to myself to concentrate on the children and the ranch and not think about anything else for a while, and I have kept that promise, very successfully, for approximately 18 months. A pause. And then you arrived in January, and it became a great deal harder to keep." She looked at him for a long moment. The night was warm and soft, the stars very thick and bright above the Texas grassland, and the porch boards under their feet were solid and real, and she thought about walls, the ones she built, the ones she kept, the ones that kept her safe and alone in equal measure. "I was hurt badly," she said. "Not in the way of ordinary heartbreak. In the way of trusting someone completely and discovering that the trust was a tool they used against me. I built a great deal of protection after that." "I know," he said quietly. "You noticed. Every fence has a reason," he said. "I'm a rancher. I know what fences are for." She looked at her hands on the porch rail. "I named the foal Hope," she said, "and I meant it." He moved to stand beside her at the rail, not touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "Then let me be clear about something," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I understand that there are complications. I understand that you have a past that has hurt you, and I am not about to add to that pile under any circumstances. But I want you to know that what I feel when you are in the room is not something I have a great deal of control over anymore, and I would rather you know it than have it be some secret we are both pretending doesn't exist." She was quiet for a very long time. Then, "It does exist," she said. "I know," he said. They stood on the porch together in the warm night until the coffee was cold, not touching, not speaking much, but with the distance between them changed in some fundamental way, not smaller, not yet, but no longer a wall. Now it was simply the space between two people who had acknowledged something real. The following week brought the second important complication of May. Thomas came to Esther during the afternoon lesson with a look on his face that she recognized as the expression he wore when he was carrying something too heavy for one person. "Miss Esther," he said, "can I ask you something that is not about schoolwork?" "You can always ask me anything," she said. He sat down at the school table across from her and looked at his hands. "I heard you on the porch last week, talking to Papa." "I wasn't listening on purpose. I came down for water and I heard some of it through the window before I went back upstairs." She waited. "That man," Thomas said carefully, "the one from your past, is he really coming?" "He wrote a letter to that effect," Esther said honestly. "Does he want to hurt you?" "He wants to have power over me," she said, because Thomas was 11 and old enough for the honest version. Some people, when they have hurt someone, feel that the power they took gives them ownership. "Marcus Grier is that kind of man." Thomas nodded slowly. "What will you do when he comes?" "I will tell him that I have nothing to say to him. That my life here is my own and does not belong to him." "What if he doesn't listen?" "Then I will say it again until he does." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Papa will not permit someone to come onto his ranch and hurt you," he said, with the same directness his father used. "I want you to know that." "Neither will I." She had the complex, layered feeling she sometimes got in this household. The feeling of being surrounded by people who would protect her not because she needed protecting, but because they chose to. Because she mattered to them. It was a feeling she had kept at careful distance for years, because the last time she had allowed herself to feel it, the person generating it had been constructing a trap. But this was different. She could feel that it was different in the way that truth has a different texture from performance. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "That means a great deal to me." He nodded with great seriousness and picked up his mathematics paper, and the lesson resumed. Marcus Grier arrived in Caldwell on a Saturday in June, 3 weeks after his letter. Esther knew he had arrived before she saw him, because the town had the specific quality of a place where something interesting has just walked through the door. Word traveled fast in Caldwell, as it did in all small territories. By the time she came into town for the weekly supply run with Joseph and the children, 3 separate people had given her meaningful looks that told her she was expected to know something. She found out from the hardware store owner, who mentioned with elaborate casualness that a Mr. Marcus Grier, formerly of Missouri, had taken a room at the cattlemen's in the previous evening and had been asking around town about the schoolteacher at the Fletcher ranch. Joseph had been standing right there when the hardware man said it. She had watched his face from the corner of her eye. He had gone very still in the specific way that careful, controlled men go still when their blood is up, not rigid, not aggressive, just utterly, perfectly calm in a way that was somehow more authoritative than any display of anger. He had bought his nails and his rope and helped the children into the wagon, and on the drive back to the ranch he had said, "I think it would be worth it for me to meet Mr. Grier in person, in town, tomorrow, with you present if you're willing." "You don't have to," she had started. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. I'd like to make certain he understands the situation here." "And what is the situation here?" she asked, and she kept her voice even, but her heart was doing something complicated and urgent. He kept his eyes on the road. "The situation here," he said carefully, "is that you are a person who belongs to herself and no one else, who has made a life on this ranch through her own intelligence and hard work, and whose past is no business of a man who treated her badly. That is the situation. I would like him to understand it. She looked at his profile against the open sky and thought about Elizabeth Fletcher, who had kept the books and raised 3 remarkable children and left a shape in this ranch that was still visible. She thought about what it meant to be loved by a good man and then lose it, and what it meant to be willing, after that loss, to open yourself to the possibility of it again. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." They met Marcus Grier in the lobby of the Cattlemen's in the next morning. Esther had dressed with deliberate care, not for Marcus's benefit but for her own. There was armor in good posture and a steady gaze, and she had learned to wear both. Marcus Grier was 40 years old and still handsome in the specific way of men who have always relied on their appearance, well-dressed, silver-tongued before he even opened his mouth, with the practiced ease of a man who has never been seriously told no by the world. He saw Esther and smiled the smile that had once made her believe he was genuine. Then he saw Joseph beside her, and the smile became something more calculated. "Esther," Marcus said warmly, "you look well." "Mr. Grier," she said. "This is Joseph Fletcher. I teach his children." "Mr. Fletcher," Marcus said pleasantly, "I hope you don't mind my visiting. Esther and I have a history." "I'm aware of the history," Joseph said. He said it calmly, the way he said most things, but there was something underneath it that Esther could feel, the way you feel a current under still water. "Miss Hurst told me about it." A flicker of something in Marcus's eyes. He had not expected that. He had expected to be the one holding information, the one with the power of her secrets. Finding her standing here, having already surrendered them herself, had disrupted his framework. It was the one thing about this kind of man that Esther had learned. They depended on secrets to operate, and a person who had already exposed their own vulnerabilities removed the weapon entirely. "She told you," Marcus said with a laugh that was not quite convincing. "Well, I hope she gave you the full story." "I did," Esther said, "all of it." "Then I'm sure you understand," Marcus said, turning back to her, "that there are still matters between us that need to be addressed, financial matters." "There are no financial matters between us," Esther said. "There never were. You borrowed money from my savings with false promises and spent it. I stopped expecting repayment 3 years ago." "That's not the version I remember," Marcus said, and his charm was shifting slightly, the veneer thinning. "It's the version I document," Esther said. She had in fact kept every letter, every promissory note, every written evidence of the financial arrangements Marcus had orchestrated during their engagement. She had learned early to document things. "I have correspondence going back 5 years that tells the story very accurately. I am happy to share it with the Caldwell sheriff at any time." The lobby had gone quiet. The desk clerk was studying the ceiling. Marcus looked at her for a moment with something that was no longer charm, something harder, colder, the calculation behind the performance. Then he looked at Joseph, who had not moved or changed expression during any of this, who stood with his hat in his hand and his feet planted on the boards in the particular quality of stillness that Esther now recognized as his most serious state. "I see," Marcus said finally. "Well, I suppose there is nothing more to say." "No," Esther agreed. "There isn't." Marcus Grier was on the southbound stage 2 days later. He did not come to the ranch. He did not write again. Whether it was the threat of the documentation or simply the realization that Esther's situation made her less useful to him as a target, she was not entirely certain, and found she did not particularly care. He was gone, and the relief of it was so profound that she stood in the open doorway of the barn on the morning after his stage left and breathed in the warm hay and leather air and felt, for the first time in years, something that did not have a trap hidden inside it. She heard boots behind her and turned. "Joseph." "He's gone," she said. "I know. Dunbar sent word." She nodded, then, "Thank you for being there." "You didn't need me to be," he said, and it was not a complaint. It was the honest observation of a man who had watched her handle herself with complete competence. "You'd already taken away the only thing he had. I just stood there." "Sometimes standing there is what matters," she said. "Having someone stand with you." He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light. The barn swallows were moving through the air behind her, quick and purposeful. The barn smelled of sweet hay and warm animals, and the June sun was beginning to make the air golden in that particular way it had in Texas before the full heat of the day arrived. "Esther," he said. "Yes. I would like to stand with you," he said carefully. "Not just for the present difficulty, not just as your employer or as an ally in a particular circumstance." He paused. He was choosing his words with the precision of a man who knows that certain words cannot be unsaid and wants to be sure they are the right ones. "I would like to court you, if you are willing. I understand that is not a small thing to ask, and I understand if the answer is no, and whatever your answer is, nothing in your position here will change. I want you to be absolutely clear on that." She looked at his face, which was so honest that it hurt to look at directly, the open earnestness of a man who had learned, probably through loss, that honesty costs less than its alternatives. "Joseph," she said, "ask me something harder. Anything else would be easier to think about." He looked confused. "What is harder?" "What you want," she said. "Not what you are willing to settle for if I'll agree to it, what you actually want." He was quiet for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted. The careful, diplomatic construction fell away, and what was underneath was the face she had seen for one unguarded moment at the creek in March, raw and real and completely his. "I want to marry you," he said. "Eventually, when you are ready. When it makes sense and when it is what you want too. I want you to stay on this ranch not as the schoolteacher but as someone who belongs here, as someone who is home here." He paused. "That is what I want." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her walls. She thought about what it had cost her to build them and what it was costing her now to stand inside them. "Then court me," she said. "Start there, do it properly and do it slowly and let me find my way to it." The relief on his face was something she was going to remember for the rest of her life. "Yes," he said. "Yes, all right." She went back into the house and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Then she got up and made coffee and stood at the window watching the morning move across the grassland, and she thought, hope. The courtship of Esther Hurst and Joseph Fletcher was, by the standards of Caldwell County, extremely proper. Joseph called on her formally in the evenings, sitting on the porch or in the parlor with the children conspicuously arranged nearby as unofficial chaperones, a role that Clara took with great seriousness and that Thomas and Margaret fulfilled with dignified restraint, except for the occasional knowing look that Margaret could not fully suppress. He brought her things. Not flowers, though Clara brought enough flowers for both of them, but books, which he sourced from the Caldwell General Store and from a bookseller in Wichita to whom he wrote letters. He brought her a volume of Mary Shelley because she had mentioned in passing that she had never read Frankenstein and had always been curious. He brought her a technical surveying manual because Thomas had mentioned that she was interested in land mathematics, and she had held the surveying manual with such evident pleasure that Joseph had looked genuinely delighted. He also brought her a horse. Not as a gift, exactly. It was not framed as a gift. He simply said one morning that there was a mare in the lower pasture who had not been properly worked and who would benefit from a regular rider. And did Esther know how to ride? She had ridden since childhood, she told him, and within the week she was exercising the mare, a gray named Silver, who turned out to have a character as strong and independent as her name suggested, every morning before lessons, and Joseph would sometimes ride out alongside her on his big bay, and they would cover 2 miles without speaking and 2 miles back in conversation that ranged so widely: history, mathematics, theology, the children's education, the economics of cattle ranching, the literature she'd been reading, that she would come back to the house slightly breathless and not entirely from the riding. She learned the ranch. She had not meant to. But there is a kind of learning that happens when you pay genuine attention to a place, and she paid attention. She learned the names of the horses and their personalities. She learned which pastures ran sweetest in spring and which dried out first in summer. She learned how Joseph managed the cattle drives, the contracts with the ranchers further south, the careful accounting that Thomas was beginning to help with. She learned the rhythm of the seasons here, different from Missouri, fiercer, starker, more honest in some way, less willing to pretend. She and Joseph had conversations that she found she could not stop thinking about afterward. Real conversations, the kind that leave marks. One evening on the porch he told her about the year Elizabeth had been sick, the long winter of it, the children's fear, the helplessness of being a man who could fix most things and could not fix the one thing that mattered. He told it without self-pity, without evasion, without the neatening of the story that people usually employ when they share their worst experiences. He simply told her what had happened, and she listened without looking away, and when he finished she said, "You did not break," and he looked at her for a moment. "I had to not break," he said. "The children needed the ranch to keep running." "That is not the only reason," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. And then you are very honest." "I have made significant mistakes being otherwise," she said. "So have I." He was quiet a moment. "Esther, for what it's worth, whatever that man made you believe about yourself, about your worth or your reputation or what you deserved, I hope you don't believe it anymore." She thought about that for a very long time. "I am working on it," she said honestly. "That's enough," he said. By July, the courtship was the worst-kept secret in Caldwell. Mrs. Dunbar had told anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming from the moment Esther Hurst arrived in January, and she said it with the pride of a genuine prophet. Vera Hutchins, who had delivered her warning about impropriety with such relish back in April, had undergone a remarkable transformation of opinion and now spoke of the Fletcher Hurst situation with warmth, in the particular way that people do when they realize they are on the wrong side of a narrative and wish to reposition themselves. The children were ecstatic, in their various ways. Clara could barely contain herself, and told everyone she met that Miss Esther was almost family now. Margaret had written a composition for her own edification in which she analyzed the evidence for the match using the observation principles she had learned in their natural history lessons, and it was thorough and accurate. Thomas, with characteristic understatement, told Esther one afternoon that he was glad she had decided to stay, and the simplicity of it was somehow more moving than any celebration. One evening in late July, after the children were asleep and the night was warm and star-thick, Joseph asked Esther to walk with him. Not on the porch but out into the open grassland, past the paddock where hope was growing copper-bright and strong, out to a slight rise in the land where you could see the lights of the ranch below and above it the enormous, indifferent, breathtaking sky. He took her hand. It was the first time he had taken her hand, and it was done simply and without drama, just his fingers closing around hers as they walked, and the warmth of it went through her so completely that she thought, "Oh, this is what this was always supposed to feel like. This particular warmth, this particular fit of someone's hand in yours, this sense of being held without being contained." They stood on the rise for a long time. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not eventually, as I said before, now, this year, before the summer is out if that suits you, or in the fall if you want more time. I am not a man who is good at waiting forever for something he wants this much, and I am afraid if I wait too long I will say it wrong." He paused. "I love you, Esther. I think I have loved you since you walked into my barn in January with 9 inches of trail mud on your boots, and lectured me about the structural deficiencies of the south wall without being asked. I am asking you to marry me and to stay here, not as the schoolteacher and not as a polite guest, but as my wife and the person who belongs on this land the way I think you know you do." She looked at him in the starlight. She thought about $9.40 and a train station, and a burning boarding house, and 3 children who had needed a teacher, and a man at a gate who had said, "Welcome to the Double F," in a voice that she had filed away without meaning to. She thought about the foal, copper-red and trembling on new legs in the morning light of May, and the word she had given her. "Yes," she said. "Joseph, yes." He made a sound that was something between a laugh and a breath, And then he pulled her toward him and held her, not the careful, formal distance of the courtship, but the full reality of it, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder and the warm night all around them and the stars overhead, and below them the lights of the ranch that was home. They were married in September of 1882 in the small whitewashed church on Caldwell's North End, on a morning when the sky was the color of new linen and the air had its first suggestion of autumn edge. Mrs. Dunbar cried freely and considered it an achievement she was due. The children stood beside their father, Thomas, solemn and proud, Margaret visibly moved beneath her composure, Clara so beside herself with joy that she had to be gently restrained from running up the aisle before the ceremony concluded. Esther wore a dress of deep green that Margaret had helped her choose from the fabric available in the general store, and Joseph wore his best suit with a bravery that she found, for some reason, extremely touching. He was not a man who liked being watched. He was a man who liked working. Standing at the front of a church being looked at by 30 people while he waited for her was, she could see from the set of his shoulders, a significant act of will. When she came through the door and he saw her, his shoulders came down and he smiled, the real smile, the one she had seen parts of and fragments of all spring and summer and now had the full breadth of, and she walked toward it as if it were a fixed point she had been navigating toward for a very long time. Reverend Aldridge performed the ceremony with appropriate brevity. The vows were simple and traditional, and when Esther spoke them she felt each word land in her with the weight of truth, not performance, not a recitation of a script but an actual promise, made to an actual person, in full knowledge of everything she was promising. When it was done and Joseph had kissed her once, carefully and then less carefully, Clara erupted into applause so enthusiastic that several adults joined her out of sheer infectious response, and Thomas shook his father's hand with a seriousness that made Joseph pull him into a hug that Thomas endured with dignity and secretly returned. The celebration at the ranch afterward involved half the county, Mrs. Dunbar's best cooking, and a great deal of the Caldwell community's goodwill being spent in one afternoon. Someone had a fiddle, someone else had a harmonica. The dancing lasted until the children were asleep on the porch chairs, and the stars were out in full force, and the night was warm and everyone was sufficiently fed and happy. After the guests had gone and the children were carried to their beds and the house was finally quiet, Esther and Joseph sat on the porch together, and it was different from every other time they had sat on the porch together because it was theirs now in a way it had not been before, not just shared but belonging to both of them equally, the porch and the grassland beyond it and the lights of the barn and the distant sound of the horses settling for the night. "Well," Esther said. "Well," Joseph agreed. She laughed. He laughed. The laughter was easy and warm and entirely genuine, and she thought that you can tell a great deal about the quality of a love by the quality of its laughter, whether it is relaxed, whether it is inclusive, whether it has room in it for all the ordinary unsayable things. "I named her well," Esther said. "Who?" "The Foal, Hope." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Turns out she knew what she was doing." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "She usually does." The first year of their marriage was the year Esther Hurst became Esther Fletcher, which she understood was not merely a change of name, but a change of standing in this territory. She was now the mistress of the Double F Ranch in a way that the schoolteacher had never been, and she took the responsibility with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything she did. She learned the ranch accounts, and imposed on them the kind of systematic order that had been lacking since Elizabeth's death, and the books became cleaner and more legible, and Joseph looked at them sometimes with an expression of genuine relief. She continued teaching the children, and now, as the proper schoolhouse was finally repaired, she taught the larger class of Caldwell's children 3 days a week, walking or riding into town while Joseph managed the morning chores. She found that she loved it. Not just the teaching, which she had always loved, but the life, the physical reality of the ranch, the wide open days, the sense of purpose that extended beyond a single classroom to a whole community. She loved the evenings when the work was done, and the children were quiet, and she and Joseph sat together, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the same warm room in the specific comfort of two people who have settled into the deep assurance of each other's presence. Clara, that first year, had the most spectacular imagination of anyone Esther had ever known. She invented elaborate stories for Hope's education, narrating to the foal every morning what the foal needed to know about being a horse. She informed Hope that being copper-colored was especially significant. She maintained a running correspondence with Hope through drawings left in the stall. She declared repeatedly that Hope understood every word and was simply choosing not to speak because that is how horses prefer it. Thomas turned 12 in that first year and discovered a passion for cartography that overtook his interest in mathematics. So Esther ordered surveying equipment through the Wichita supplier and taught him the basics of proper land mapping, which he then applied to an astonishingly accurate hand-drawn map of the entire double F acreage that Joseph had framed and hung in the hall. Margaret turned 10 and received for her birthday a complete collected works of Charles Dickens that Esther had been saving for since spring, and Margaret spent the next 6 weeks in a state of profound literary absorption that produced 3 extremely detailed compositions comparing Dickens to the actual observable behavior of the people of Caldwell, Texas, which was both incisive and somewhat alarming. The spring of 1883, Esther realized she was pregnant. She told Joseph on a Thursday evening, matter-of-factly, standing in the kitchen while she was making biscuits. She had learned to make biscuits, considerably improving on Clara's definition of what constituted a good biscuit, and he was sitting at the kitchen table going through the accounts. "I think we are going to have a child," she said. He looked up from the accounts. She watched his face go through several expressions simultaneously, so that it was difficult to read the sequence. But what settled, what stayed, was something so luminous and unguarded that she felt her own heart swell in response. He got up from the table and came to her and put his hands on either side of her face with such tender care, as if she were something extraordinary that he was afraid to mishandle. "Esther," he said. "I know," she said. How are you feeling?" "Extremely well, also somewhat terrified, also overjoyed all at once." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Same," he said softly. The children's reactions were exactly what anyone who knew them would predict. Clara produced a response of such exuberant happiness that she had to run 3 circuits of the house to dispense some of it before she could sit still. Thomas said, "That is wonderful news," with great sincerity, and then shook both their hands, which made Joseph choke on something that might have been emotion and might have been laughter. Margaret said, "I have been expecting this," with the calm assurance of a person whose hypothesis has been conclusively confirmed, and then added, "I would like to be involved in the naming process, if that is acceptable." It was acceptable. The naming committee, which expanded to include all 3 children and occupied several weeks of very serious discussion, eventually produced the name William Joseph Fletcher for the boy that Esther delivered in November of 1883 in the bedroom above the kitchen, while the November wind came down off the plains, and Joseph sat outside the closed door in a state of controlled but visible anxiety for 4 hours, until Dr. Hennessy opened the door and said, "Mr. Fletcher, you have a son." Joseph sat beside Esther on the bed with William in his arms and looked down at the new face with the expression of a man looking at a miracle he had not entirely allowed himself to believe in, and Esther watched him hold their son and felt the particular fullness of a life that has been built honestly and carefully and has exceeded all expectations. Clara climbed onto the bed beside Esther and announced that she intended to teach William everything she knew, beginning immediately, and no one had the heart to point out that William was 3 hours old. William grew up fast and loud and cheerful, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness, and by the time he was 2 years old it was clear that he was going to be a person of considerable presence. Hope, now a proper grown mare in the paddock, regarded William's first attempts at interaction with dignified patience, and Clara presided over their relationship with the authority of someone who considered herself Hope's original protector and guardian. The double F expanded in those years. Joseph brought on 2 additional ranch hands, and the cattle operation grew to cover a broader range. Thomas, now 13 and 14, and then 15, was spending his after-school hours working alongside the men, with a focus and capability that made the hands treat him with a respect they would not normally extend to a boy his age. Margaret's education was beginning to push against what Caldwell could offer, and Esther and Joseph had long conversations about her future, about the possibilities that existed for a girl of Margaret's intelligence, and what they could do to ensure those possibilities remained open. They wrote letters. They made inquiries. A women's academy in Wichita had come to their attention, one that offered genuine academic preparation at a level the Caldwell schoolhouse could not. Margaret was 14 when she first heard about it and 16 when she sat across from Esther at the kitchen table with a very controlled face and said, "Do you think they would accept me?" "I think," Esther said, "that they would be fortunate to have you." The acceptance came in the fall of 1886, when Margaret was 16. She left in January of 1887, on the same Southern Pacific that had brought Esther to Caldwell 5 years earlier, standing on the platform with her trunk and her carpet bag and her full collected works of Dickens, while Clara cried with the specific ferocity of someone who does not cry often and means it when she does, and Thomas stood with dignified solidity and shook his sister's hand and then hugged her. And Joseph held Margaret for a long moment and said something too quietly for anyone else to hear, and Margaret nodded and said, "I know, Papa, I know." Esther was the last to say goodbye. Margaret held her hands and looked at her with those sharp eyes that saw everything. "You gave me this," Margaret said. "You should know that." "You gave yourself this," Esther said. "I just knew where to point." Margaret looked at her for a moment with the face of someone who is choosing their words with great care. "My mother would have liked you," she said. "I have thought about that many times." Esther could not speak for a moment. Then, "Thank you," she said. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." Margaret boarded the train. The platform emptied. They drove back to the Double F in the January cold, with Clara still red-eyed and William asking questions about trains with inexhaustible 3-year-old curiosity, and Joseph's hand finding Esther's on the wagon seat and holding it for the full 7 miles home. The house was different that night with Margaret gone. Quieter in a way that had texture to it, not bad exactly, but present, the way all significant changes in a household are present. After the children were in bed, Esther and Joseph sat by the fire, and she was leaning against him with his arm around her and a book open in her lap that she was not really reading, and the fire was doing its ordinary beautiful things, and outside the January wind was reminding the prairie who was in charge. "She is going to be remarkable," Esther said. "She already is," Joseph said. "She gets it from your side, that sharpness." "She gets the stubbornness from somewhere else," he said, with a precision that made her look up at him. "I have no stubbornness whatsoever," she said. "No," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in it. "None at all." She settled back against him. The fire spoke quietly. William was asleep upstairs, having thoroughly exhausted himself on the train question. Clara was asleep with the specific absoluteness of someone who has spent all her tears and needs to restore. Thomas was asleep because Thomas was sensible about sleep. The house breathed around them. "I was thinking," Joseph said. "Tell me. There is good pasture on the north parcel that we haven't developed. I've been talking to Fletcher at the neighboring ranch." He paused, smiled at his own name on another man's lips. It was a familiar comedy in the county, the other Fletcher, Nathan, about a possible partnership on a breeding program. Good bloodlines. Hope's foals have been consistently strong. Hope is an excellent judge of quality, Esther said. She was well named, he agreed. She thought of Clara in the barn with the copper-red foal's muzzle in her hands and said, "I choose you," and the barn going quiet and Joseph's face across the straw, and herself with her heart stopped and her walls already crumbling without her permission. Clara knew, she said. She always knows, he said. At 6 years old she had more sense about this than I did. You had sense, he said. You had reasons. They weren't wrong reasons. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. You just eventually decided the reasons were less important than what they were protecting you from. She thought about that. How does a rancher who talks about fences get so profound? I have an excellent schoolteacher for a wife, he said. She laughed. He laughed. The fire went on with its business. In the spring of 1888, Esther was pregnant again. This time she told him in the barn because she had been checking on Hope's new foal, Hope's third. A dark bay colt, and Joseph had come in looking for her, and she had just said it. We are going to have another child. The second time he heard it, the reaction was different. Not less, but different. The surprise replaced by a kind of warm certainty, a recognition rather than a revelation. He took her in his arms right there in the barn, smelling of hay and horses and the outdoors, and held her with the easy completeness of a man who has learned that the best things in his life tend to arrive when he is not specifically watching for them. What do we think? He asked against her hair. I think we are very good at this, she said. At farming, he said, and she pulled back to look at him with the expression she used when he was being deliberately obtuse, which she did not entirely mind. He was grinning. She had never tired of his grin. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1888, and she was named Elizabeth Ann Fletcher, for both their reasons and for Esther's mother, who had been the one steady goodness of Esther's childhood, and Elizabeth for the woman who had first built this home and who deserved to have her name carried forward by the people who lived in it. When Esther suggested it, Joseph had been quiet for a very long time, and she had thought perhaps she had miscalculated. But then he had said yes, with the quality of a man receiving something he had not known how to ask for. Clara, who was now 12 and constituted something between a force of nature and a benevolent organizational authority, took Elizabeth's arrival with the same absolute conviction she brought to everything she loved. She declared herself Elizabeth's primary protector and educator, and set about this role with a thoroughness that occasionally required gentle managing. William, who was 5, inspected the new baby with the careful thoroughness of someone performing an audit, and concluded that she was, in fact, a satisfactory addition to the household. Thomas was 18 when Elizabeth was born, and he was now working the ranch as a full partner. Not just an earnest boy alongside the men, but an actual capable rancher with opinions and skills, and a steady judgment that made Joseph look at his son, sometimes with the specific pride of a man seeing himself improved upon. Thomas had also, quietly and without announcement, begun courting the daughter of the neighboring McLaughlin family, a quiet, serious girl named Anna, which Clara noted and endorsed immediately, and the rest of them were tactful about. Margaret wrote letters from Wichita that arrived every 2 weeks, detailed, wonderful letters full of her studies and her teachers, and the specific observations of someone encountering the world in large doses for the first time. She wrote to Esther separately from the family letters, letters that were more personal, that asked questions and shared doubts and celebrated victories, and Esther answered every one with the care they deserved. Between them had grown something that was not quite mentor and student anymore, but not yet peers, something in between, a relationship with its own particular shape, built on years of Tennyson arguments by firelight and honest conversations, and the specific bond between a woman who had needed to matter to someone and a girl who had needed to be taken seriously. In 1890, Margaret came home for the summer. She arrived on the Southern Pacific, not on a Thursday like Esther had arrived 8 years before, but on a Saturday in June, and the whole family was at the station because Clara had organized it, and no one denied Clara when she organized something with that much intention. She came down the steps in a blue dress with her hair up and her eyes bright, and she was 20 years old and luminously, conspicuously herself, sharper and broader and more whole than she had left, but the same Margaret underneath, unmistakably and permanently. She embraced them each in the order of their emotional urgency, Clara first, because Clara was already reaching, William next, who was now 6 and had reached the age where he understood that Margaret was someone important, Joseph with a long, fierce hug that said everything, Thomas with the comfortable ease of two people who have always understood each other, and last Esther, whom she held onto for a notably long time. "You look well," Margaret said. "So do you," Esther said. "You look like yourself." "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in months," Margaret said. "They are very interested in Wichita and who you are going to become, less interested in who you are." "And who are you?" Esther asked. Margaret considered this with genuine seriousness. "Someone who wants to teach," she said. "Someone who wants to write. Someone who believes very strongly in the power of education to correct the particular injustices that this country has chosen to maintain." She paused. "Also someone who needs a very good meal and a decent night's sleep, because the dormitory mattresses are unconscionable." They fed her. They gave her her room back. They sat on the porch in the June evening, and the ranch spread out before them in the fading light, and the horses moved in the paddock, and Hope, older now, a distinguished senior presence among the mares, lifted her head at the sound of Margaret's voice and held it there for a moment as if acknowledging her return. Clara noticed. "Hope remembers you," she said. "Hope remembers everything important," Margaret said. "She was always very wise." She glanced at Esther. "Named appropriately. That summer was one of the best of Esther's life." Margaret was home, and Thomas and Anna McLaughlin were engaged, and William had learned to ride with such natural ease that Joseph took him out on the cattle pastures, and they came back dirty and sunburned and enormously pleased with themselves. And Clara was 12 going on 45, and conducting the household with a benevolent authority that everyone pretended not to defer to, but absolutely deferred to. And little Elizabeth was 18 months, and had just begun walking and regarded every new discovery as a profound personal achievement. One evening late in July, Esther was sitting on the porch long after the children were in bed, watching the stars and listening to the night, and Joseph came out and sat beside her, and she thought about that first evening 8 years ago when the night had been warm and soft, and she had told him everything she had been hiding, and he had said, "Those are the most dangerous kind," and looked at her with honest eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "January of 1882, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was a good month. I arrived with $9.40. I know, you told me that once. I didn't know anyone. I had nowhere solid to stand. I was running technically from something I had not outrun yet." She paused. "And then you were at the gate and you said, 'Welcome to the Double F,' and I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought, something about this man is going to complicate your life considerably." He laughed quietly. "Was I right to apologize for that?" "Don't you dare apologize," she said. "I would have been furious." He reached over and took her hand, which he had done so many thousands of times by now that it was as natural as breathing, as expected as sunrise, as simple as the most fundamental things are when they have been the right things all along. She turned her hand over and let his fingers fold around hers. "You named the foal right," he said. "I did," she agreed. "Esther." "Yes. I love you," he said. Not for the purpose of saying it after a sentimental porch conversation, although the timing happens to work. "I love you on ordinary Tuesdays and on difficult weeks, and when the books don't balance, and when the weather doesn't cooperate, and when Clara has organized something elaborate that neither of us had time for. I love you when you are teaching Thomas's mathematics in a way I cannot follow, and when you are reading Tennyson to Margaret with the complete conviction that the poem requires, and when you pick up Elizabeth without putting down the book you are holding, which you do regularly. I love you in all the ordinary specific ways, not just the ones that are easy to say." She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight. "I love you back," she said, "in exactly the same ordinary specific ways." and in some that are harder to catalog. He pressed her hand against his chest, over his heart, where she could feel it beating with the solid, unequivocal rhythm of something real. They sat there until the last of the summer stars began to tip toward dawn. Thomas and Anna McLaughlin were married in the spring of 1891, in the same whitewashed church where Esther and Joseph had been married 9 years before. The wedding was somewhat larger than theirs had been, because Anna McLaughlin had 4 sisters and a large family with opinions about events, and the resulting celebration was the most elaborate social event Caldwell had seen since the Regional Cattlemen's Association meeting of 1889. Thomas, at his wedding, wore the same composed, solemn dignity he had always worn, but he held Anna's hand with a gentleness that told a completely different story, and Esther watched him from the pew and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing someone who has been careful with their heart find a person worthy of it. Margaret had come home for Thomas's wedding, and she had brought with her a gentleman from Wichita, a schoolmaster named David Carr, who had studied at the University of Kansas, and who regarded Margaret with a combination of intellectual respect and helpless admiration that Esther recognized on sight. She cornered Margaret in the kitchen the morning after Thomas's wedding and said, "Tell me about Mr. Carr." And Margaret had gone slightly pink in a way that was enormously endearing and said, "He is very good at history and he thinks women should have the vote." And Esther had said, "Excellent criteria, Margaret." And Margaret had said, "I thought so." David Carr would propose to Margaret the following spring, in 1892, and Margaret would accept with the same considered certainty she brought to all her most important decisions. By 1892, the Double F was one of the most productive ranches in Caldwell County. The breeding program Joseph had started with Nathan Fletcher, the other Fletcher, always a source of local amusement, had developed well, and Hope's bloodline specifically had produced 7 foals over the years, several of which had been sold at premium, and one of which, a chestnut stallion named Promise, was the finest animal Joseph had ever bred. Clara, now 18, had appointed herself Hope's specific steward, and had learned more about horses and their management than most men twice her age, and she rode with the confidence and skill of someone born to it. Clara, at 18, had not yet brought home a suitor, which did not concern Esther, because Clara was the kind of person who would simply announce one day that they were getting married, and everyone would discover they had met him 4 years ago and just not understood the significance. Clara conducted her own timeline. This had always been true. William, at 9, was a force of nature wearing a child's face, vocal, curious, physically fearless in the way of boys who have grown up in wide-open spaces and never received the memo about limitations. He was learning to help Thomas with the cattle in the summers and learning to read with the determined ferocity of someone who has decided that books are a territory worth conquering. And he and Esther had begun their own version of the evening reading ritual that had once been her and Margaret's different books, different conversations, William's questions less literary and more literal, more interested in how things actually worked, which led them from Dickens into natural history, and then into the mechanics of things, the science of how water runs and how seeds grow, and how the principles Joseph had taught them about land and management connected to the larger systems of the world. Elizabeth, at 3 and then 4, was a personality that had not yet revealed its full shape, but showed every sign of becoming something specific and strong. She had Esther's directness and Joseph's stillness, which was a combination that Thomas said, with the authority of a brother who had watched this all his life, would make her someone to reckon with. She had taken to following Hope around the paddock with the devotion of a disciple, and Hope, now 15 years old and of distinguished senior status, permitted this with an equanimity that Clara said was Hope's highest form of endorsement. "Hope is named correctly," Clara had said, now that she was 18 and had the authority to say it with resonance. She has always been about what is coming, what is worth waiting for. Margaret and David Carr were married in Wichita in the fall of 1892. The whole family traveled by train, Joseph's first time on a train, which produced in Esther a private delight that she managed to restrain within acceptable limits, and William's first time, which produced nothing but enthusiastic and comprehensive questions for the entire 4-hour journey. The wedding was beautiful in the specific way that two extremely intelligent people's weddings are beautiful, deliberately arranged and intellectually coherent, and also genuinely romantic. Because Margaret had never done anything halfway in her life, and a wedding would not be the exception. Esther stood with Margaret before the ceremony and straightened her veil and looked at her, and felt everything she always felt when she looked at Margaret, the complexity of a love that had not been expected and had arrived anyway, the particular joy of watching someone you care for inhabit their life fully. "Are you happy?" Esther asked. "Profoundly," Margaret said with the precision of someone who means every syllable. "Good," Esther said. "That is all that matters." Margaret took Esther's hand. "You made this possible," she said. "All of it, not just the academy and the education. You made me believe that women could expect more than what the territory offered by default." Her sharp eyes were very direct. "The injustice of what that man did to you, what men like him do to women, I think about that. I write about it. I intend to keep writing about it." "Good," Esther said again, and meant it even more. She watched Margaret walk down the aisle to David Carr, who watched her come with the expression of a man receiving something extraordinary, and she thought about a girl who had asked, "Is it better to love something knowing it will hurt you?" and a woman who had answered from the specific experience of someone who had learned the truth of it. The years continued. They always do. Clara, at 22, brought home a young man named Samuel Reyes, whose family had ranched in the southern part of the county for 2 generations. He was quiet and capable and deeply good-humored, and he looked at Clara with a steady, abiding regard that reminded Esther of a specific quality she had once stood on a porch watching come toward her. Clara announced their engagement with the same absolute certainty she had always brought to her most important conclusions, as if it were simply the confirmation of something she had known for a long time and was finally getting around to formalizing. Their wedding, in 1898, was the occasion of the most unrestrained celebration the Double F had ever hosted, and Joseph danced with Clara in the yard in the October evening, and Esther stood at the edge of the dance watching his face, which was the face of a man experiencing a happiness that has earned itself through years of difficulty and choice. After the dancing, late in the evening when the last guests had gone and the October stars were out in force, Esther found Joseph at the paddock fence, his arms resting on the top rail watching Hope, who was now, if you calculated it out, 17 years old and still moving through the paddock with a quiet dignity that the younger horses seemed to sense and orient themselves around. "She's been here almost as long as you," he said, when Esther came to stand beside him. "Almost," she said. "She arrived in May." "I arrived in January." "You named her," he said. "Clara let me name her," she said. Clara understood what she was doing. She always did. He was quiet for a moment, watching Hope move in the moonlight. "When she asked you, in the barn that morning, I understood what she was asking." "I know," Esther said. "I saw your face." "I was terrified," he said. She looked at him. "Of what?" "Of you saying yes," he said. "Because if you said yes, then everything I had been telling myself for 4 months about keeping a respectful distance and not imposing and all the very sensible reasons, all of it was going to fall apart." He paused. "And it did. You said hope and it fell apart, and I have never been more grateful for something falling apart in my life." She leaned into him at the fence rail the way she had learned to years ago, just the comfortable, natural weight of two people who have spent so long standing beside each other that it is more natural than standing apart. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the $9.40. You mention that regularly. It marks a before and after," she said. "Before Caldwell, before the Double F, before Clara and Thomas and Margaret and all of it." She paused. "Before you." He put his arm around her. Hope lifted her head at the sound of their voices and stood looking at them for a moment with the dark, liquid eyes that Clara had always said understood everything important. "What do you think now?" he asked. "About the before and after." "I think that the before," she said slowly, "was necessary. Everything I went through, the loss, the fear, the running, I needed all of it to be the person who arrived here on that January Thursday. I needed to have broken and rebuilt myself enough times to know what real ground felt like when I was standing on it." She looked up at him. "You were real ground, Joseph. The first time I felt it in years." He looked at her in the moonlight, and after 18 years the Creekwater eyes still had the same quality that had undone her, honest, deep, unequivocal. "And now," he said. "Now," she said, "is the best part of my life. Including the last 18 years, all of which were the best part of my life." He pressed his lips to her temple and kept them there. "There is a mathematical paradox in that statement," he said, and she could feel the smile against her temple. "I have an extremely good mathematics teacher," she said. Hope moved away from the fence into the deeper moonlight of the paddock, unhurried, certain of her ground. The night was warm for October, which Texas sometimes granted as a gift, and the stars were doing their particular work overhead, and below them the double F lay quiet and settled, the barns and the house and the good fence lines, the south pasture and the north parcel with its developed grazing, the creek somewhere in the darkness where the willows were, and where Esther had once come around a bend and found a man with his boots off and his guard down, and had not turned back when she should have. The house held its children sleeping: William, 17 now and more rancher than student, in his room with the surveying maps; Elizabeth, 12, still on the threshold of becoming, already showing the sharp shape of who she was going to be. And beyond this house, in houses of their own, Thomas and Anna and their 2 children, Margaret and David and the work she was already doing, Clara and Samuel beginning their own particular life. Esther Fletcher, who had once been Esther Hurst with $9.40 and a burning boarding house and a carefully maintained set of walls, stood at the paddock fence with her husband's arm around her and the night complete around them, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been built honestly from what she had and what she'd found and what she'd chosen, brick by ordinary extraordinary brick. "Come inside," Joseph said. "In a moment," she said. "I want to watch her for another minute." He stayed beside her while she watched Hope move in the moonlight, and the night held still, and everything that had been built here. The love, the family, the years, the small daily acts of choosing this life over every available alternative, was present in the weight of his arm around her shoulders and the way she leaned into it. And nothing remained unresolved. Nothing remained dark with the particular darkness of the unspoken or the unknown. And the morning would come as it always did to the double F. With light first on the upper pasture, and then the barn, and then the windows of the house, and they would be in it together, as they always were, as they always would be. Hope tossed her head once, copper now turned silver in the moonlight with age, and walked with her old dignified grace to the far corner of the paddock where the grass was sweet, and Esther watched her go and thought about a 6-year-old girl holding up a new foal's muzzle with her arms already open, and the word that had come out quieter than she intended, and everything that word had meant, everything that word had become. "All right," she said. "Let us go inside." They walked back to the house together across the October grass, and the door opened to the warmth inside, and it closed behind them, and the night held the double F in its wide and starlit hands, and everything was whole.